Well, good morning, everybody. You all just missed an amazing 2-hour conversation between Conner and I that is very much off the record and will forever stay off the record.
Not the storytelling we want to share.
Interesting nonetheless, but maybe you'll just have to come to my house and listen before we record sometime. God, then someone else will make a podcast. They'll be like, this is what they talk about when they're not recording on storytelling on the plains. So today we're going to pick up with part 2 about the peopling of western Nebraska. You didn't think last time we covered too much of the same ground, did you? I don't know.
I think, if anything, I blathered on a bit.
Yeah, we both did. I mean, we spent, I think, 15 minutes talking about MASH.
We did get into MASH, didn't we?
Yeah. We talked about a lot of stuff, but, I think if people follow us by now, they know that it's really hard for us to stick to the subject because it's kind of like when my husband goes on Wikipedia and he looks up something about how fountain pens are made, and then I'll walk by later and he'll be reading something about he'll be reading about the death of Elvis Presley, and I use that as an example because that actually happened one time. He's reading about fountain pens on Wikipedia. I walked back by him like a good 45 minutes later, and he was reading about the death of Elvis Presley, and I'm going, how did you get there? And he goes, I don't know, I was reading, I clicked on this thing, then I clicked on something else, and now I'm here. Okay. And I mean, that's kind of how you and I's conversation goes all the time. So
hopefully it's a little interesting to our listeners still.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, they can listen to two people blather on about silly stuff. Living, at least this person here is a liberal living in western Nebraska, and they can hear about that sometimes. I try not to say too much, but
it is the 4th of July. It won't be posted, of course, on the 4th of July, but we are recording on the 4th of July, so happy 4th of July. I should say belated.
Yes.
By the time this gets out here, but I hope everyone enjoyed their 4th and stayed safe. No one blew off any fingers.
Oh, God, I hope not. And since it's the 4th of July, that means today is Tuesday, and I try to have everything done by Tuesday night. So let's see how much editing I get done.
It's a holiday. It's okay.
Is it like garbage? Like our garbage didn't get picked up today. It'll get picked up tomorrow. So if I'm a day late with the podcast, that's okay.
I think our folks would understand.
Yeah.
I think they'd be okay with that.
Yeah, we're just two crazy people out here doing our own thing. So in part 1, we also talked about the tribes that were here, the fur trappers and the traders, and then Hiram Scott. And then a little bit more about the people who passed through the area on their way west. And today we're going to talk about the people who actually settled here. At some point in time, yes, we'll do some Oregon Trail stuff and maybe diaries from the trail. I don't know why I keep avoiding that. I kind of do. That's really labor intensive because you have to go and read dozens of diaries, and which bits do you pick out, which bits don't you, and then if you pick a bit out just on flowers, well then do you have to go read every flower description and pick out some more, where it's so intense. How do you pick what to do? And
which is kind of funny when you think about it, because you come out here on the Oregon Trail, it's like, what is Irene and Conner talking about? There ain't much to talk about at all. It's just a grass and a dirt trail. What are these pioneers talking about? There's nothing to see out here.
Yeah. And I did text you the picture of the rattlesnake. I found the baby rattlesnake the other day.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a very good picture I put up on my own website. You can see its eyes, and because of the angle that I took the picture on, it actually looks like it's got eyelids and lashes. But it is a really good picture, and he or she lifted its head up, and when it did that, I stood up because I didn't know at that point in time if it was a bull snake or a rattlesnake. either way, I don't want to get bit.
I don't want to get bit by any snake.
And it stuck its tongue out, but I didn't try to get a picture because I'm trying to figure out what it was going to do. And when it lifted its head up, it started to uncoil, and that's when I saw the rattle, and I'm like, great, I'm going to die. And then it just kind of curled back up into the prairie grass and went away, and I didn't chase it. So it was...
And that's most rattlers around here, they really don't care much for people.
No,
I mean, they'll
no.
leave you alone as long as you leave them alone.
Yes, so if I went into the grass after it, let me get another picture of you. I'm getting bit.
Get bit.
Yeah, so I just let it go.
It's what's that guy from Jurassic Park 2? The second one that says stay out of the long grass. That's my advice for ticks around here and snakes. Just remember that guy from the second Jurassic Park. And they didn't listen to them either.
Nope.
Everyone was just running out in the long grass. Yep. They all died.
Hell, they didn't listen to Jeff Goldblum in the first one. Oh, we made them all so that they can't reproduce. And Jeff Goldblum was like, really? It's going to happen. Finds a way. Yeah. Don't listen to the scientists, folks, if you want the world to explode. So anyway, today we're going to talk about the people that actually settled in the area and get you a little bit up to speed on how things went here. So G.L. Shumway wrote a lot about the early history of western Nebraska. His books hold accounts of a lot of topics from the mundane to the dramatic. I don't know, I kind of find some of the mundane things interesting as well. He wrote that everything worthwhile seems to be disputed, and that was his short summary of the entirety of western Nebraska. And after learning about this area, he kind of was right.
Isn't that what I just said? What are you guys talking about?
So we know Nebraska was a big part of the Oregon Trail, and if y'all listen to this and you have a way to be in western Nebraska toward the end of July, there's a week-long conference of OCTA. Did I send you that email with the speakers that we're talking? I think the speakers are free, so I think I'm just going to free up July 28th and go listen to some of the speakers. Mm-hmm. But they have an entire week of events, and some of them are tours to different places in the area, which I don't need to go to because all but one of the tours, I've actually been to those places, so I don't really need to go on those tours. But the speakers are pretty interesting, and OCTA is the Oregon California Trails Association, and their annual conferences this year in Gearing. And Legacy of the Plains Museum is right there in the shadow of the monument, which runs along Mitchell Pass on the Oregon Trail. Yeah, so
that's pretty cool.
I forgot that they were coming. Someone pointed it out to me a few days ago, and I looked at the speakers, and I don't think the speakers cost any money, which is why I shot you that email.
Yep.
So I think I'm going to go. I haven't had time to look at it closely, and if it's free, I'm definitely going to go. Yeah. And if it's not too much money, I can go. But some of the tours are like $65, but they leave at like 5 a.m, and you're touring all day, and they provide you lunch. So
it's not bad at all, especially depending on where you're going. If you're not from this area, you can drive a long ways before you get anywhere.
They're going to take a tour to Ash Hollow.
Okay.
And then there's another place in Wyoming they're going to go to Fort Laramie, and then all the Oregon Trail places around here, Chimney Rock, the Monument, and I mean they're definitely worth the money, but I'm not going to learn anything new, I don't think, from going on them, because those kind of tours it is OCTA, so they already know what Chimney Rock is. And there's a good chance I'm going to know 85 to 90% of the anecdotes that they tell, just because I live here and I've researched it. But
and does this bring a lot of fanfare? Like a lot of people come to this?
I don't know. So the thing they're advertising is this is the first time the conference has been here since Chimney Rock redid their museum, since Legacy became... Legacy, and since the monument redid their visitors
okay.
area.
So
So
there's new stuff to see.
yeah, so everybody that, even if they came the last time they were out here, you're looking at least a decade, because Octa is in a different place along the trail every year.
Okay.
So it's been at least a decade since they've been out here. And if somebody went to it last time, you're going to learn something new just because there's all this new stuff. But I've been to it all, so... But the speakers, in particular, there's going to be a gentleman talking about the Buffalo Soldiers, and I do know quite a bit, but this guy is kind of like the expert on it. So even though I know quite a bit, dude's the expert, I'm going to learn something from him. So I want to go and listen to him talk. Mm-hmm. So anyway, see, we're already off topic. So we know Nebraska was a big part of the Oregon Trail. It only took 13 years for Nebraska to go from a territory to a state, and it had been a massive part of the Louisiana Purchase. People don't really realize how big the Nebraska territory was. Mm-hmm. You know, it's much smaller as a state, but it was a huge part of the Louisiana Purchase. And at the time, people thought purchasing the land was a mistake, and Stephen Long said that Nebraska should be known as the Great American Desert, and that plans for doing anything here were set back several decades because he really promoted that idea and people believed it. So It took longer than it really should have for people to settle here because everybody was just like, it's a desert. Not quite.
Yeah, we also had, there's also, of course, the native disputes. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this was already technically bought territory and stuff like that. Yeah.
So while we scoff at the notion of Nebraska not being good for anything at the time, in a way they were right, because without irrigation, you're still not going to be living in most of the state. You could live on the eastern part very easily. The western part where we're at would be a lot more difficult without the irrigation. Mm-hmm. And if you go look on a map, the eastern side of the state is green, and by the time you shift around the center part of the state, you've got sandhills to the north central, and the west is all plains and prairie.
Yep. Although I guess this year it flip-flopped on us because of the weather. Yeah. It actually there's a drought over North Platte. And we don't have one here.
No, we have too much water.
Yeah. That's a weird thing to happen in this state.
When we had the hailstorm last week before, people were concerned about flooding.
I heard that.
And I'm going, nothing flooded in my house. Are you sure? I got some. I'm like, yeah, I didn't get any flooding. I'm good. I didn't lose any windows either, but apparently our roof is totaled. And you look at the roof and it looks fine. But I don't know enough about roofs, and it's all covered in insurance, blah, 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 whatever.
Exactly.
And the thing that's funny is they even said that some of the screens need to be replaced, and I'm going, my screens are fine. I don't see anything wrong with that. But the screen here in this basement window on the right side is partially torn off, but there's a huge plastic cover over top of it. Yep. So it was not hit in the hailstorm. So my only damaged screen was not hit in the hailstorm, but they're trying to tell me that I need my screens replaced. And they look perfectly fine to me. So
insurance companies are great.
Yeah. Okay. So back to Nebraska and irrigation. So people mostly didn't want to come here at first. They just wanted to go through it. And although it was first proposed to become a territory in 1844 by Secretary of War William Wilkins to protect people who did settle here, it did not become one until 1854. Stephen Douglas quickly proposed a bill, but that was solely because he wanted the Pacific Railroad to be headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, his home state, and he also wanted all Native Americans out of Nebraska. So running a railroad through the area and having it start in his state would have been a huge win for him. So there were bills introduced in 1844, 48, 53, a second one in 53, and 1854. So yeah, they tried twice in 1853. The 1854 bill was a modification of the second 53 bill. And, you know, don't you just love politics? Nothing has changed. Oh, the bill didn't work? We have an example of that this year in Nebraska. The 6-week abortion ban failed, and everybody was like, great, issue's dead, we're going to keep the 20-week ban. And then suddenly 2 weeks later, it's a 12-week ban is attached to another bill, and that got pushed through. So nothing's changed in 200 years. They just keep trying and trying and trying.
Well, Nebraska was, I guess, this territory. So who would have been trying to the bills are trying to be passed in Congress?
Federally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they just kept trying and trying and trying, and that's how good the propaganda, so to speak, was that this place was all desert. We don't want it. It doesn't need to be a territory. We don't want it. And then they just kept trying and trying and trying, and part of it was racist. They want to get Native Americans out. Part of it is, but, you start the railroad in Chicago and run it through Nebraska, you're going to have commerce going through. So you had both sides fighting over it and pushing it. And so, over the course of 10 years, eventually people will learn the truth that it's not entirely terrible out here.
Have we been doing a good job for you viewers? If you think that that here's not a terrible place, please leave us a comment.
And then there was the big racist part of it. So in general, northern states didn't want slavery, southern states did. And I'm being general here because we're not getting into the weeds of this. Everyone,
There's lots of weeds in that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Everyone thought that if you bring a railroad from Chicago out here, those pesky northerners like Irene with their anti-slavery ideas were going to come in here, and then the West was going to be all full of people who were against slavery. And there were people that actually thought that.
It's not entirely untrue, to tell you the truth. Kind of.
Yeah, if you look at generalizations.
If you do you're right, it is generalizations, so I don't mean to make light of this, but it did seem that once the push out west started really happening, the wake up started happening.
Yeah. So there may be some credence to that idea because Douglas and others thought Nebraska would never be a slave state because there was nothing for slaves to do here. So they had actually thought about it. They're like, well, it's a great American desert. There's nothing there, so why would it be a slave state? What are you going to make them do? And at the time, there was not really any labor. There was a shortness of buildings, or a shortness of building actual rail tracks, and that was only a temporary job, so there wasn't a need to have slaves here permanently.
The person that made that statement was a slave putting on their coat, helping them put on their coat, you think, as they were saying there was no need for slaves out here and that kind of ridiculous stuff. It's just
So Douglas was also smart enough to keep his mouth shut and not to wade too deep into the debate of popular sovereignty, even though he was a proponent of it. And I'm not going to go deep into popular sovereignty, but I will explain it a little bit. So popular sovereignty is the principle that the authority of a state and its government are created and sustained by the consent of its people, who are the source of all political power. Popular sovereignty being a principle does not imply any particular political implementation. So we're not going to cover political science today because I'm not an expert on political science or popular sovereignty, but
I guess I was wondering, is that eminent domain? Is that what we would call eminent domain?
No, that's something completely different. Yeah, eminent domain just means that we have the God-given right to all this land as far as we can go. And if we hadn't hit the Pacific Ocean, we probably would have kept on going. That was the idea behind that. So popular sovereignty sounds good, but it really isn't when you start considering morality. And that's why a lot of Northerners were angry over the idea of Nebraska. They viewed it as a way for slavery to easily expand west. And it gets way more complicated than this.
And this wasn't the only state, right? Or the only territory being disputed. Was it just Nebraska?
At that time?
Or was the Dakotas involved in there? Kansas?
Yeah, when you look at the Louisiana Purchase, it went all the way up north, South Dakota, Wyoming, a little bit of Wyoming, Montana. I think part of Idaho was in it. I mean, it is a huge, vast area. You have to really look
at the old territory maps to see what we're talking about. When we say Nebraska, it's not what we
view today as the state. Yeah.
It is very, very big.
And I would rather... and it would get us a little bit off topic unless someone could talk about it specifically as it related to, that's another guy that's talking at Legacy, Brian Croft, I believe his name is. And I've heard him talk before, and he does history through maps. And
those are really
he'd be a good guy to be talking about this kind of stuff. And me being, just some Joe Blow that read stuff in a book, I'm not an expert on popular sovereignty. But because of all of this, it got kind of ugly for a while with anti-Nebraska and thus anti-slavery views being printed in newspapers. So a lot of people don't realize this even, and how do you get into this when you learn Nebraska history in 4th grade? You don't understand politics to the level you need to understand that how huge this was. They got to bring it down to a 4th grade level. So,
and unfortunately, you don't learn about the Civil War till the 5th grade, so they really go backwards.
So this is how you ended up with the Republican Party. People hated Lincoln because they saw him attempting to end slavery. And again, need an expert if we're ever going to go into details on this. So the Secretary of War at the time, Jefferson Davis, name sound familiar, publishes 5 railroad surveys to find routes across the country and to hopefully settle all of these arguments. 4 of those routes went through the South, and 1 went north, and it was far north. I want to say it was in North Dakota, but it was at least upper South Dakota. I mean, it was well north of us. There arguments were made that the southern routes were shorter and thus less expensive, and they also didn't need to worry about snow covering the tracks in winter, and the elevation changes were lower. Thus, figuring out grading changes would have been easier too. So the southern routes had a lot going for them because, it was more cost effective, and ongoing costs were less as well than if you figure going up north, to get through Montana, even if you went through Wyoming, you still got the Rockies there you got to go through. You got winter. You got to clean the tracks off. Yep. So you got all these additional expenses.
Well, and you also need the railroads to head to the ocean because that's where the ships are that are bringing all the goods. So I could see why the South would be a little bit more lucrative. Being you had the Florida coast. And all that, so.
Yeah. And so because everybody was bickering over this for so long, the Civil War started, and that ended much of the controversy. The southern states had left Congress, and the Homestead Act and Railroad Act were passed, and these were huge bills that caused rapid changes in Nebraska. I just find it funny because nothing's changed at all in Congress. You still argue for years over stuff before anything gets done. These people argued for so long that the Civil War started. I mean,
that's not comforting.
No. So the Nebraska Territorial Legislature wanted statehood in 1859. And again, I'm not going to get into too much of the Nebraska Territorial Legislature because it was mostly on the...
fascinating.
It is fascinating, but it was mostly on the eastern end of the state. And I mean, I'm fine getting into it, but
it's complicated. Look up unicameral. Like if you have Google, look up unicameral. I think we are the only state that has a unicameral form of governing. And that is a fascinating rabbit hole, but I don't think we're going to get into that.
The whole thing with becoming a state, where are we going to put the capital? The fighting over that. But that's all the eastern end of the state, which is why I hesitate to get into it, because we're trying to stay over here. So the Nebraska Territorial Legislature wanted statehood in 1859. They were told no. They proposed it to the people in 1860. They also said no because they didn't want their taxes raised. Does that sound familiar?
Fair enough.
163 years later, and everyone's still griping about their taxes in Nebraska. I don't know. I agree. I don't like paying taxes, but it's not something that consumes my life. That every time I have there are people I know in this town. Every time I have a conversation with them, it's going to go back to taxes, and I just have better things to do than argue about that all the time.
They're going to get your money one way or another, folks.
Yeah. So the legislators also said no because they were only in the Nebraska Territory to make a quick buck in railroad and land speculation. They were from back east. People in the legislature who are only in it for themselves and aren't from here. Where have I seen that before? Could it have been last election with people running for governor?
Hey, what did we just talk about? Politics, not getting into politics.
Yeah. And they were shady as well. These speculators either bought land or convinced veterans to sell their script. Many of these Civil War veterans weren't going to move to Nebraska and were happy to sell to the speculators. That's a whole other story. But after the Civil War, lots of veterans got these parcels of land, and they weren't going to come out here. So I'll sell it to you. When you know this, you understand why Nebraska was not settled by farmers. Remember, this place wasn't good for farming at the time, and these speculators wanted to develop the area, not farm it.
Mm-hmm. They were basically wanting to make like a New York or a Chicago here in the middle of nowhere.
And even more of them just wanted to make a quick buck and get out. They didn't even care if those towns succeeded. They just wanted to make their quick money and leave. Let somebody else deal with maintaining the railroads and maintaining whatever little towns were there. So in 1864, voters voted for statehood, though not everyone thought it was a good idea. They had to form a government and constitution, but nothing got done. So again, this goes back to the history of starting the state, which is a fascinating rabbit hole. They met for one day in Omaha, and I guess they screwed around because they didn't do anything. Governor Saunders pushed them along in 1865 to get stuff done, and finally in 1866 things started to change. There was a meeting between the territorial legislature and the state legislature. They wrote a constitution, but it was done in secret, and we don't know how many people were involved. So the basic structure was formed, but it was just a bare bones document, and here's the best part. Or worst, if you're me. This document is voted in, but only for white males. Yep, not going to say anything else. I'm biting my tongue, Connor, because not going to say anything. So fortunately, the U.S. Congress was all, your Constitution sucks and it's unacceptable. President Johnson urged a pocket veto, he used a pocket veto, letting Nebraska's Constitution die. So Nebraska modified their constitution, taking the suffrage part out, and Johnson vetoed it again, saying Nebraska doesn't have the population to be a state. His real argument was that he didn't want equality in Nebraska. And I don't think I explained it, and I'm trying to remember it now, but basically a pocket veto is they wait till Congress goes home, and then you just kind of let it die, and there's nobody there to do anything about it. Anyway, Congress overrode the veto, making it the only state to have joined the Union with an overridden veto. Nebraska. It's not for everyone. True then, true today. And I want to read a little from the history of Western Nebraska and its people, which was written in 1926, and I'm going to read it to you because I found it amusing. Nothing in history exceeds in romantic interest the discovery and settlement of the New World, of which Nebraska and Cheyenne County are a part. The history of Nebraska begins with the Spanish invasion of Mexico and settlements at Santa Fe and Taos. Then later with the voyage of La Salle when he took New France, now Canada, and the region of the Great Lakes and the territory of Louisiana in the name of Louis the Great, King of France. Spain, followed by France, thus became the first owners of the territory now comprised in Nebraska. In 1763, Louisiana Territory was ceded back to Spain, and what is now Cheyenne County, though unmarked and unnamed, was in this territory. In 1802, Spain again ceded the territory to France, which prepared the way for Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, by which Louisiana Territory became a part of the young republic in 1803. Cheyenne County was part of that. This section of the country was inhabited only by the roving bands of Indians at the time, and little was known of the country this far west. May 30th, 1854, Nebraska Territory was created by an act of Congress, and in 1866 the question of the admission of Nebraska as a state was raised. All conditions required by Congress were complied with, and on March 1st, 1867, the territory ceased to be, and the great state of Nebraska came into existence. So that's how we became a state according to the 1926 version. Now, for getting people settled into our part of the state, most of what we know today as Western Nebraska really began about 75 minutes southeast of here in a town called Sidney. Sidney became a town right around the time Nebraska became a state. It was significant because it was the main railroad point for the entire panhandle. As we'll see in a little bit, the railroad was a major reason for settlements out here. They are the key to where people live and how goods and services were brought into the area. So what typically happened was people took a train to Sidney. When they got to town, they often had another destination in mind and had to travel there by wagon or train. There was a big trail known as the Sidney-Deadwood Trail, which went north into South Dakota. Folks who were headed to Deadwood stopped. Folks who were I can't talk today, Connor. I need a drink of water. Folks who were headed to Deadwood stopped here because Sidney was the closest rail stop at the time. Anyone living to the north and west of Sidney at the time would then be reliant upon wagons to haul their stuff to where they lived. Not the most ideal situation, but it was done on a regular basis, so it worked. From Sidney, people would travel north to Camp Clark, which is between Baird and Bridgeport today. You could then branch off into several directions, depending on your destination. For folks coming here to Scotts Bluff, they'd stay on the north side of the North Platte River, and those going to Gearing stayed on the south side of the river. In 1886, the first settlers arrived in what is now Scotts Bluff County, and we'll get into that later. It used to all be Cheyenne County, and now it's Cheyenne, Banner, Scotts Bluff. I think part of Sioux County was in that, but I'm not sure. But anyway, it got split up into several counties. It used to just be one big county. Shumway wrote that they came because of advertising of the Desert Lands Act of 1877, Homestead Acts, and preemption laws. He described them as having walked in from Camp Clark, but since the only way to the camp was via train in Sidney, it's likely they came by rail and then walked. Who knows? His book isn't completely clear on that. Whatever. Someone might have trekked across the state. It seems silly, but it's still plausible at this point in time. Gearing is a little bit weird here in this respect. It's up and running, and the Union Pacific Railroad says it wants to bring a rail line through town as early as 1885, but Gearing didn't officially become a town until March 7th, 1887. So if the railroad is seriously considering bringing a line through the area, it had to be big enough to warrant lots of settlements. But Scotts Bluff ends up being bigger. And I say weird because we know Gearing had more stuff going on before Scotts Bluff did. Man, I hate this stupid rivalry. You grew up in this, and as someone who moved here, I mean, y'all are part of the same big town, just divided by a river, and you act like you would literally go to war over some dumb stuff.
To be fair, you did come from New York.
I came from upstate New York.
There's a lot of rivalries I hear up there. But you're right. The Gearing-Scottsbluff rivalry has been something that's never been quite... and there has been several times they've suggested to fuse the cities.
Yeah.
And make it one city. I think that's been offered several times now, at least in my life. But no,
I've lived here since 2007, so 16 years, going on 17, and they've talked about merging the fire departments, the police department, and the school districts. And you would save a lot of money. Just the school districts, if you had a county school district, so you're not just merging Scottsbluff Gearing, you're sticking in Mitchell. Is Morrill and Sioux or Scottsbluff County? It's in Scottsbluff.
Morrill, I think you get into Morrill County, don't you? Or is there a Morrill County? There's a.
Yeah, no, it's either Scottsbluff or Sioux. I think it might still be Scottsbluff. Okay. But then you also got Minutair. So you've got at least 4 school districts. If you make that county school district, you've eliminated 3 superintendent positions. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're looking at easily $500,000 a year that you're saving that you can put toward education. But yeah, they won't do it. But anyway, it all goes back to here. They're they're separate then, and they still seem to be separate. So I don't get it. I will never get it. Anyway, it goes all the way back to this fighting over a railroad and a bunch of other stupid stuff. But Shumway was right. Everything worthwhile seems to be disputed. And there's nothing more aggravating to me than listening to a person from Gearing and a person from Scottsbluff arguing over who's better just because of where they were born. And I've heard those arguments. I've listened to people say that they're a better person because they were born in one of those towns over the other one. And
well, and again, you could get into that, into several reasons why people think that, but education does, I think, have something to do with that, because it's different. Mm-hmm. It depends on who you ask how it's different, and I won't get into that, but it is different.
Yeah. And I think we covered it before, but it also goes back into who was here first, farmers or ranchers. They argue over that. To me, it doesn't matter. You're both here. You're both doing your thing. It doesn't matter to me.
Don't you need to grow something to feed the cows? Well, I guess you had grass everywhere. But.
Yes, but, God forbid we say anything like that. But the documentation actually says ranchers arrived first.
I guess that's fair. I guess to me, I'm neither a farmer or a rancher, so.
Yeah. And then even if you hear a farmer say, okay, yeah, we weren't here first, but we're better stewards of the land, there's always something to argue about. It's like listening to arguments from when I was a kid about, who's better, Mighty Mouse or Superman. Do you even know who Mighty Mouse was?
Of course I do.
Okay,
yeah, not that bad.
I'm just checking.
Who's Superman?
See, at least Mighty Mouse is from this planet.
I guess I didn't get into the origin story of Mighty Mouse.
So anyway, just work together and be peaceful people. So another thing they complained about, the mail. Yeah, you bet, man. more things change, the more they stay the same. You and I, when you walked in my door today, we were talking about the mail.
Yes.
So, we still talk about that today. So mail was super important here to a lot of people. And people bid to get one of the routes. And one of the routes was called the Star Route, and it brought mail to Gearing from Kimball through Ashford in Banner County, which is now a ghost town. And the route came about because people complained that their mail was dropped on the other route, which came from Camp Clark. And I can identify with that. I don't know if I told you, Connor, but a couple of weeks ago, I go out for a doctor's appointment and come back about 90 minutes later from my doctor's appointment. And it was the dentist, and he's about a half a mile from my house. So I come back home, and my mail is strewn all over the road. And it had also been raining, so I was kind of ticked off. Thankfully, my husband's soccer magazine that comes, football magazine that comes, is wrapped in plastic, so his magazine was okay. So the mail doesn't arrive till 3 hours after I got home. So where the hell did my mail come from? I have no idea. And why was it all over the road? Okay, I'm sorry if my mail got delivered to somebody else's house by mistake. Bring it over, put it in my mailbox, put it in between my front door, knock on my door. I've been getting a lot
of that problems too, and it's not the mail people. It's the companies that I use. They put the wrong address.
Oh no, this all had the right address, but I'm just like, why did you throw it all over the road?
Yeah.
I don't get that. It really aggravated me. I sent a very long text to my husband that more than filled the screen because I was so angry about it. So the settlers out here, I get it. I'm not happy with the mail delivery either. And if people are chucking mail for Scottsbluff and Gearing, say down by Chimney Rock, you're never going to get your mail. No. At least here, this was in front of my house in the middle of the street. And I recognized, he has a subscription to World Soccer, so I recognized the magazine. I'm like, that's my mail. Otherwise, I would have just pulled in and went in the house and not thought about it. But
And for our younger viewers who probably, they should know this, but you never know. People are taking technology for granted all the time. But this really was the only way you could communicate.
Yeah.
We didn't have the telegram yet. The Pony Express wasn't quite around yet, although that would come and make mail better.
Mm-hmm.
And did we have the Pony Express by the time
we did? But
it would have been just trying to make the routes through here.
Yeah, I think they were still doing it mainly rail to Sydney, brought it up to Camp Clark, and then brought it over to us. And because it wasn't getting over to us, people complained, and so they were like, "All right, we'll take it over to Kimball and bring it up that way," and then that way seemed to work.
Because also mail was how you got your house. I know that kind of sounds weird maybe to some of our young viewers, but Sears and Roebuck's, if anyone still remembers Sears, if I'm not that old, Sears and Roebuck's was your first mail-in order everything. Yeah. They had everything in this book, from antique furniture to houses. The only catch was some assembly was required when it got there.
Yeah, yeah. I had forgotten about the fact that you could mail order a house. Wow, that's good memories there.
A lot of it was out here were probably the Sears and Roebuck's houses.
Yeah.
In fact,
or
there
a sod
are still
house.
Some out here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather have a Sears and Roebuck house than a sod house. So.
And I was going to start getting into deep diving about sod houses because I don't think they were very popular for very long because of the railroad, and it got more into wood houses.
So put that on your list,
it's on the list.
then one day you'll lead the podcast, and I'll get to ask the questions. So one of the big disputes also came down to who gets things such as the county fair. Yeah. We're disputing everything. At the time, Cheyenne County was huge and covered most of western Nebraska. And I'm going to read a bit again from the history of western Nebraska and its people. Cheyenne County was created by act of the first state legislature in 1867, and at that time contained the territory since erected into Banner, Dual, Garden, Kimball, Morrill, and Scottsbluff counties. So there you go. I knew it was at least 4, but it was more. 1, 2, 3. It was 6. So Scotts, and I need to get in touch with the person I know that knows all the details about it, because the fighting was hilarious to me. So Gearing holds the first Cheyenne County Fair on September 26th to 28th, 1887, and this becomes a big deal when Cheyenne County is split up, and Scottsbluff County has to figure out where everything goes from here. Lots more fighting and arguing and bickering, and everyone wanted to be their own county seat. There was a proposal of 5 counties, as well as making 2 counties on Plum Creek, and eventually everything gets settled to what I just read it is today.
Mad.
Yes. So the first Scottsbluff County Fair was then held in 1890 in Gearing. But here's where it gets a little interesting, and more bickering and shady dealings. So everything's cool until the Burlington Railroad builds its tracks on the north side of the North Platte River, leaving Gearing stranded. Frank Beers, the Scottsbluff County Fair Association president, was ticked because he was a major stakeholder in the fair. So he moves his hardware store to Mitchell, and a bunch of other business owners moved to Scottsbluff and Minutair, all on the north side of the river, and all stops on the railroad. So Beers gets all crabby with the county fair and plans with other dudes in Mitchell to have a fair there. There's some wheeling and dealing, and the fair goes forward. They have a racetrack, no buildings, a tent for exhibits, and some livestock that were literally tied to trees. So you think about going to the fair today, all the livestock, they're in their little pens and stuff, but nope, they had them just tied. They'll just wrap a rope around a tree. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Beers had been buying fair stock along with his Mitchell friends. And on January 12th, 1912, the Gearing stockholders realized they didn't have a majority of shares, and the ones that did, Beers and his men, voted to move the fair to Mitchell. So, I mean...
And it's, to my knowledge, been there ever since, right?
Yes.
I mean, it is still to this day.
To this day, it still is, yes. So you get a little bickering about this, and Gearing ends up as the county seat, which it still is today, as a consolation. And if I remember correctly, nobody was happy about that either. But I think it kind of worked out for Gearing. I know I get kind of crabby that I got to drive down to Gearing. Is not that far away. I mean, it's literally a 10-minute drive to the county courthouse. But when I got to go to the DMV, I'm like, I got to drive all the way down there.
But much like Harrison, up north, the county seat kept towns alive because the county seat was there, and that's why Harrison is still there. Harrison would have been a ghost town a long time ago if the county seat wasn't up there for their county. So it's one of those weird things. I can see why it was coveted. Yeah, because I could see Gearing fading away or being eaten up by Scottsbluff. Yeah, if it didn't get the Gearing county seat first.
Yeah, and there was way more bickering on all of that, and I need to see if I can get in touch with the lady that has way more detail on that, because she studied it so much. She could probably recite you the information. She could say, oh, it's in this book on page 72, and just recite it. But this is the bits that I remembered and could go back and find. But it was a big deal. The Gearing was like, hey man, you took our fair, give us the county seat. And
I suppose it was nice of them to negotiate that way, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? If anyone comes to Gearing and Scottsbluff today, and Mitchell, you probably see who got the fair end of the shtick there. I mean, like, all our industries in Scottsbluff. Gearing doesn't have much of anything. Yeah. For a while, it didn't even have a grocery store. So.
And folks who live in Gearing, they get angry when you tell them that they're a bedroom community to Scottsbluff. But that's what they are.
I could see it, yeah. There just really isn't... There used to be businesses. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was businesses there, but now, I mean, the mall was built there. Both of the Walmarts were built in Scottsbluff. everything was built in Scottsbluff.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just is the way it worked out.
And the main highway goes through there too. I mean, you got 92, which is the old Oregon Trail Road, and I can see where back when all this happened in 1912, you're thinking the old Oregon Trail is still the main road, but now you've got the major highway. You know, a lot's changed in 100 years.
Yes.
So you got time to add on to figure all that stuff out too. And I think Gearing does all right. I mean, they've got the Five Rocks Amphitheater, which they've been able to bring several acts in. They got Legacy of the Plains is there. The monument is there.
Monument there. The Civic Center. They do have a decent Civic Center there that puts on lots of stuff.
And in the time that I've lived here for almost 17 years now. They've gone from one hotel to 3.
That is true. They have built a few more motels and a lot more apartment complexes.
Yeah, so. Yeah. They have expanded. And when the the Northfield Retirement Villa, I think it was, they were part of another Northfield retirement community. They were both Northfield something, and they were related to each other. There was one in Scottsbluff, one in Gearing, and the one in Gearing, and I covered this for the paper. The one in Gearing was they just had a declining population, and they didn't have enough people to keep it running, and the folks that couldn't, because I always get confused with the assisted living, the folks that need help every day, they could move over to the place in Scottsbluff. The folks that didn't need help, they had outlines. So they had like a main building, and then they had outlining buildings. And the outlying ones, the folks that can take care of themselves, come and go as they please, stayed. And then Twin Cities Development took over, redesigned them into affordable apartments.
Okay.
And so I forget what they're called now. I think they kept the Northfield name. But instead of that place just rotting, they were like, we can do this. We don't have enough housing out here. We can make affordable housing out here. So they've done that. And I think there's 54 units there. I'm not sure. I mean, I did that story 8 years ago.
And I believe the last time I checked the census, the population has been declining still.
Yeah.
It has been declining for a very long time. We haven't really evened out, and we haven't bumped up. So
Yeah, and we're kind of stagnant, I think.
It's stagnant, yeah, and it's still slowly lowering, and Gearing is kind of turning into that. I don't want to say the bedroom. So
but I mean,
the retirement community of the county, it's starting to look more like that.
Yeah, because by and large, all the businesses are in Scottsbluff. And it just kind of worked out that way. So, to get back to 1912, there's also a ton of firsts in town. And this is going to tie into next week. Let's hope Irene gets it written. I'm just going to share one plus a fun story from these early days. According to Shumway, the first permanent settler within the limits of present-day county of Scottsbluff was Charlie Foster. Lem Wyman held that distinction, but he moved away, so Shumway gave the honor to Charlie. There are a lot of other firsts, and we'll get into those separately, but there was also Oscar Gardner, who somehow managed to convince a bunch of his friends to move to the area with him. And remember, everybody still thinks there ain't nothing here. And so Oscar Gardner moves here, and he tells all his friends that it's awesome out here.
How impressed were they? Like they get off the wagon, it's like, okay, so serious, this is a joke, right? We're not here yet. That's the punchline, right?
Yeah. So Oscar's friends brought their businesses with them, and Shumway has a story in his book about Oscar, and that he was another one of those who walked into town. His first night in town, he stopped at the Old Code Ranch, COAD. He was invited to supper and stayed the night. He was sleeping in a bunk on the kitchen floor with Jim Shaw when he saw some kind of night prowler in the room. So Oscar says someone's in here. And Jim goes, yeah, skunks, and rolls over and goes back to bed. So Oscar learned the next day that the skunks came into the kitchen every night. They ate whatever was dropped on the floor during supper and then left again. And so this dude, Jim, that was sleeping in the room with him was just like, yeah, it's just the skunks, no big deal.
Okay. It's whatever.
So that should give you an indication that living in western Nebraska was not a cakewalk. The diaries we have frequently mention the area was desert-like and no one could live here, but obviously a bunch of people saw the potential. I'm going to go back and search the Archives of Legacy of the Plains Museum because I know there's a copy there, but I swear it's in Shumway's book too, about a guy that settles in southeast of Gearing. He built his house and then put in a well. A few years later, the well went dry, so he literally picked up his house and moved it someplace else. And then when that well that he drilled went dry, picked up his house, moved again. And again, that brings everything back to the water, and water being necessity to all life out here, from the animals millions of years ago up to Native Americans, to the immigrants on the trail, to the early settlers today. Everyone's constantly thinking about it. And I've been told that story by a couple of people who have read Shumway's book, and one lady, the one I was just talking about before, I swear she has Shumway's book memorized. And so when she told me that story, I know it's in there somewhere, but his books aren't neatly organized. And so it's not like you can follow some kind of pattern where you're like, oh, I know it's after the story of Conner, because it's not. It's just like, oh, by the way, here's this cool story, and then he goes back to something else. So I know it's in there. Anyway, I remember when I first moved here, and the first time it rained, I'm listening to the weather report, and I'm going, what? Did I hear that correctly? And I purposely waited. It was like the 6 o'clock news, and I waited to listen to the 10 o'clock news, because y'all measure in fractions of an inch. Mm-hmm. And in New York, it's like, oh, we got 2.5 inches of rain. We got 4.5 inches of rain. And sometimes they'll even say how much rain you got. And, oh, if it was wintertime, it would be this much snow, and vice versa. And here it's fractions of an inch. And I just remember, I don't want to call it culture shock, but I really wasn't prepared for rain being measured in fractions of an inch. But it goes back to showing how much every drop of water matters out here. And it depends on whether you're going to survive or not, whether your crops are going to survive or not. So we get the first attempts at irrigation in 1874 in Fort Sydney. It didn't work well. The earliest record of irrigation working is in 1881, and maps from the early 1900s show farmers and ranchers using this new technology to exploit the land. We got 10 minutes left on our SD card, so we need to hurry up. Sorry, I just happened to glance down at that. Shumway wrote, it was pump well in the very beginning. The early pumps had no water to prime it, and the pump does not act without priming the river. At that early day, the only 2 bridges on the North Platte were Camp Clark near Bridgeport and Fort Laramie. Because the water was so thin, people would cross the sandbars all times of the year except June and July with very little difficulty. If one followed the track of the wagons gone before, a good load could be pulled across the river, but if one got out of the beaten track, there was more or less trouble. It was not uncommon for pioneers to experience tragedy if they got off the tracks. Many of our early settlers were from Iowa and Cass County. Some were Civil War veterans. I know there was a town in Banner County which was made up of only vets. Most were white men, though there are some fantastic stories of of black settling here as well. Ranchers typically took the highlands, while land along the river bottoms were taken by pretty much everybody else. Veterans came out here because the thinking at the time was you survived the Civil War, you should have some land. So those who didn't sell their plots to the speculators came out here to give it a go. One of the most famous was Martin Gearing, who served in the infantry, and he founded the town of Gearing. So while you hear a lot of people say they're Germans from Russia around here, they and Mexican Americans came much later. If you were in early Scottsbluff County, you're seeing whites, white veterans, and black people. Another famous family in the area is the Gentrys. Benjamin F. Gentry homesteaded near current-day Minnetonka. He arrived in 1886. The family diaries show their cook was black. This wouldn't have been odd with the Empire settlement near Henry, which we're going to get to as well, which was an entirely black settlement. And it's, I say near Henry, it's technically north of Henry, but kind of in Henry. It's a confusing thing. It's easier just to say Henry. And I need to take you out to the cemetery out there, Connor. We can experiment on our portable things again, see if we can screw it up a second time. I've got pictures of the cemetery, and the stark reality of life is right there. Most of the babies who are buried there were black. There was a black Episcopal church at one point there. The black community was gone by the 1930s, and if I remember correctly, it was around 20 years that they lasted. Even though a bunch of businesses moved to Scottsbluff when it started, most of them were staying in Gearing. When the Burlington Railroad was finished, a lot of new people arrived because railroad lets you travel better, more people can get here. So by 1900, the trains were running, and Japanese and Germans from Russia, laborers started to arrive. Then you got the planting and harvesting of sugar beets, and even more laborers make Scottsbluff their new home. And if you go look at the data, and I've read it elsewhere, and I think it's in Larry Gibbs's book on sugar beets, once Great Western comes to town for sugar beets, Gearing grows at a rate of 300%, and Scottsbluff was at 290%. Yep.
I think it was at one point the fastest growing city.
Yeah.
In the U.S., I should say.
The Pathfinder Dam gets built in 1907, and you have even more potential with irrigation, which drives further immigration into the area. And if you look at the data in any historical records for this time period from 1910 to the mid-1920s, this area explodes with people. While the Great Depression sucked, Scottsbluff and Gearing managed to fare it a little bit better. Don't get me wrong, there were tough times, but the area seemed to deal with it a little better. The actual stock market crash didn't appear in the Scottsbluff Star-Herald until several days later, and it wasn't front page news. If I remember correctly, I think it was buried like on page 6. Mm-hmm. And I think the isolation of the area kind of helped with that. So through all the fighting, squabbles, and tiffs, this area has still managed to hang on over the years. And we'll see what happens in the next 20 years because the population is aging, and it's not getting replaced. Yeah. It's not like grandma dies and, there's a 2-year-old grandkid that technically replaces them. It's just not happening. People are dying, and there's not a lot of people coming back to the town. People move away, and even those who come back aren't able to afford homes and children. So there are people that move, like, my husband and I moved here. When we moved here, we were in our late 30s, and we still thought in the next year or two we would have a kid. And we couldn't afford a home till we were 50.
Yep.
And so there was no way we could afford to have a kid. We could barely feed ourselves. So we're 2 people that moved here, but then we're not helping the population grow. And there's been more than 2 old people since we moved here die.
Yeah, and Scottsbluff is one of those towns where it's not an incredibly expensive place to live, even to this day. I mean, we're not, it does not cost a whole lot of money to live here adequately comfortable, I should say. But if you're going to still try to own your own place, own your own home, own your own land, it really isn't any different from California or New York, because we don't have the jobs that pay the money so you can afford those nice things.
Yeah.
So it's a catch.
Yeah.
And it always has been a catch living here. That's been the deal that you make, it seems. It's like you'll be okay, but you ain't going to be rich out here. At least you might make it as one of the few rich people, but ultimately.
Yeah. And I think we are going to continue to see a decline in population, though I am interested in seeing how work from home goes, because technically my job writing for Inspire Today, it's all about here in the Panhandle, but I work from home. And when I finish writing a story, I email it to my editor and he proofreads it, and then it gets sent on to the folks who copy edit and lay the paper out. And so I'm writing in Scotts Bluff. My editor lives someplace else in Scotts Bluff. And the two people that copy edit and lay out the pages, one lives in Gearing and one lives in Baird. So even though we text each other and we'll call each other and we'll email back and forth, I don't really see them. But my job is the type of job that I can do that. And we do have more work from home jobs coming.
We do.
But
there was some influx, I noticed. We did have some people from Colorado and California. I don't think it's going to change, because then you just have the reasons of if I can have a at home job anywhere in the United States, why in the world would I come here? Mm-hmm. So I just don't see it unless something drastically changes with our climate, which I just mentioned. This year has been an incredibly wet year. Very, very odd.
Yeah.
You'd come here and you wouldn't know what we're talking about when we said desert just a few, because we have been measuring in inches.
Yes. And what are you going to do as time goes on? Because I remember several years ago, I just figured out it wasn't 10 minutes, it was 10 hours. I just watched it clock down. So they weren't seconds, they were minutes. Yeah, so we're good on time. I do need to clean the SD card off, though. But several years ago, I interviewed a gentleman about, changes in technology and farming. And he said he basically sits in his tractor, reads a book, and when he gets to the end of the field, he has to turn the tractor around.
Yep.
And the only reason he was doing that was he couldn't afford the more expensive tractor that turned itself around.
It turns itself around, yeah.
And he even said by the time his grandson took over, and his grandson was like 3 or 4 by then, so his grandson's like 8 or 9 now. And he said by the time his grandson takes over, his grandson can be sitting in a building somewhere and be running the tractors and farming them. So you consider how much farm and ranch land we have. I think ranchers, you're always going to have the people there for that.
Maybe.
Yeah.
The price of beef is ever going up, and raising cattle out that far north or even out here is starting to become more and more impractical.
Yeah.
Just as technology is coming in again. They just made major breakthroughs not too long ago about lab-grown meat. Mm-hmm. And you can start to buy that. It's getting put on the market, and if that becomes popular and more viable, then I think you can kiss the cows goodbye here.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We could go on and on about that,
yeah.
But the cattle did do a massive amount of damage to the environment here. So it's one of those take it and leave it things. And same with the farmers. They've always had problems here with drought. Mm-hmm. But this year they've had the opposite problem. It's so wet they can't get out into the field to plant the seeds in the first place. So there's going to be trouble here, so we're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 to 20 years, because, I mean, I have 17 years before I can retire. I know you got a little bit longer, but... A
little bit longer? I don't get to retire.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I keep forgetting you're the...
I'm of that generation that word doesn't exist.
In all honesty, if I wasn't married to who I was married to, I wouldn't be retiring either.
Yeah,
I'm Gen X, and I think our generation kind of got half screwed because some of them had the wealthy boomers, and that was, the wealth was passed on, and I happened to come from a boomer that became a single parent that we struggled to put food on our table. So if I wasn't married, I have never had a career where I would ever have a chance of retiring. But fortunately, my husband does, and we will at some point in time. And it's also why I was able to say, yeah, I'm going to leave my last job and now go back to writing. Because of his job, I can afford to do that. Otherwise, I'd have 2 jobs or more. So it's interesting. I'm looking forward to see where all that stuff turns and goes to. And if Scottsbluff Gearing ever grows up, I mean, is that your phone or my phone? Do you hear that?
Yeah, it's on my phone. I do hear that, yeah.
Oh, it's my phone. The phone is actually ringing.
You're popular today.
I even put it on mute, and I'm like, why do I hear this humming through my headphones? So anyway, people are still going to argue, regardless of what the population size is. Is Scottsbluff or Gearing better? Who has the better football team? Who has the better schools? They don't really fight over water anymore, and I really need to look into that because I only know one guy that knows about the water wars. But, silly little arguments still come up, and I don't think that's ever going to change. But that's the basics of how the people got here and how things came up around here. And we can go pick any subject and go into more detail about, which we will. But for the time being, I'm going to go back and read some more of Shumway's books and learn some more cool things. And I'm going to put it out here right now because you were with me at the museum that day. I've got all the information I think I need about the first marriage in Scottsbluff.
Yes.
And that is going to be our episode next week on Storytelling on the Plains.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to Storytelling on the Plains, a podcast about the history of Western Nebraska. If you enjoyed this episode, visit our website, storytellingontheplains.com, where you can subscribe to the show through a variety of podcast hosts so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, visit patreon.com/storytellingontheplains, where you can get the episodes early and bonus content. You can also help promote the show by sharing the podcast with others, posting social media, or leaving us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, thanks for listening to Storytelling on the Plains.